available with the MEA of India.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'll be sharing it on the group.
Please put it on the group and send me a mail also, so that I am
Okay.
also in the know-how, because I'm not on WhatsApp.
Okay, yes, sir.
So just send me a mail
Okay, okay, sir.
and share it with. As I keep telling you, any information that you come across, any perspectives, any good stories, do keep sharing with the group. It's a good thing. So then
Yes.
the choice of picking up or reading, it depends on the person. And most people are very efficient in figuring out what to read and what not to read and what to quit. Today we are
Okay, sir.
all evolved in such a way that irrespective of all these information which is coming out, we filter out very well.
True. Okay, sir. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, sir.
Great.
Sir, you are host now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Firoz, if you want to leave, you can leave.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay. So we are doing Unit 20 today, debates on nation and transnation. In fact, this whole unit on transnationalism, we talked a lot about transnationalism. There is a certain amount of repetition, but there are some new perspectives which came out in this unit, which I want to talk about. Inevitably, we over a period of time, we have discussed about how transnationalism and how globalism is there, and how transnationalism differs from diaspora, or how all diasporas can be transnational, or all transnationalism can be diaspora, and some diaspora can be transnational, and so on and so forth. So there are some debates on nation and transnation that we are going to do in this. So let's start with the concept of nation and transnation and some debates on that. A little bit about the nation concept. So inevitably, nation is used interchangeably with terms like state, country, ethnic group, race, etc. How does a nation differ from a social group? In fact, there has been a thing about that nation is a new concept, though some scholars talk about the fact that the concept of nation came out with these Greek philosophers. Somebody's mic is on, I think. Hang on. Shanmugam, let me mute. Okay. Shanmugam, I've done that. I've muted. Okay. So, hang on. So the word nation is derived from the Latin word nasci, which means to be born, means born or to be born, which very clearly, again, as I said, in academics and scholarly pursuits, you have to look at first the definition, then who is defining it, and what is the context of that definition. Because definitions based on who is defining, what is the context of the definition, the meanings can change. So if you look at to be born, it morely likes to, a term of racial or ethical or ethnic meaning, ethical meaning, ethnic meaning, racial or ethnic meaning, conception of a nation. And this typical conception came from the German philosophers, descended from a common stock. Germans were a lot of, did a lot of work in trying to do race, ethnicity. So the whole, if you see, the Nazi philosophy also came from the superior race. They were talking a lot about race. The idea of nation is misleading, because there is no nation in the world belonging to the same racial stock, because inevitably the whole story of humankind since its evolution has been one of movement. And when we have seen in various diaspora, when people were moving, when Europeans were moving, or the Asians were moving, or Africans were moving, they were intermingling, they were cohabiting, and they were producing offspring which was a cross race. So today, if any person in the world, their DNA is tested, each one will have a certain percentage of African DNA, this DNA, that in various stocks. What happened? What happened to my? Okay. There is some problem with this. Hang on. Let me. Okay. You can see the slides change? Guys, are you able to see the slides change?
Yes, sir.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
So some of the definition, Burgess defines a nation, a population with ethnic unity. And if you see, each definition may not be an absolute one when you see today's nation states. unity inhabiting a territory with geographical unity. Leacock says a body of people united by common descent and common language makes a nation. Baker says a nation is a community of persons living in a defined territory, bound together by bonds of mutual love. And you all know that all of them are not true in the sense of a nation today. In all such definition, most political thinkers emphasize that every society, enough of a distinct tradition to be called a character, has a natural right to political independence, what is called self-determination. So if you see political thinkers, and this particular chapter dwells more into politics or the political theory or political studies. And inevitably, the term self determination came in because that was a jargon which was put. John Stuart Mill thinks that any portion of mankind may be said to constitute a nation if they are united among themselves by common sympathies. Then you need to ask who will define common sympathies? What are common sympathies and who will define them? Baker gives a more realistic definition. A nation is a body of persons inhabiting a defined territory and thus united together by primary fact of living together on a common land. Now, again, the united is a problematic terms. What is united? So if you see in academics and scholarly pursuit, how you problematize a word or a definition will lead to some other answers. They were drawn from a number of races. They come from different breeds, but their wanderings brought them into a territory. They settled down here because it appealed them to settle down here. While living together from sufficient time, they developed two forms of mental sympathy. And he goes ahead and defines this mental sympathy. So, what is happening? Hang on. Here. So first was common capital of thought and feeling, acquired and transmitted in the course of common history. The second was a common will to live together for future freely and independently. This also, when you look at a nation, say for example, when you look at a country like India, a nation state like India, a lot of times you will feel that it may or may not be true. And yet, India is a nation state. And what about India? When we look at any nation state, all these conditions may or may not be true. And yet, these are these nation states. So obviously, various philosophers or various scholars or various political scientists have tried to define nation as they understood it in terms of, and inevitably, more often than not, they try to set that there has to be something common for a set of people to define themselves as nation. While some, for example, Smith argue that these feelings of belonging are rooted in some form of essentialized and primordial identity. Others have stressed that the socially constructed nature of this form of national community. So if you remember, even when we were studying diaspora, a lot of definitions of diaspora were almost like it's no predestined that as soon as a person goes from one nation state to another nation state, stays out there, a diaspora formation happens. Whereas some scholars said, no, this is not the case. There is some sort of a mobilization which happens, and that reasons could be varied. Similarly, others have stressed that this is more like a socially constructed nature of the form of national community. So more often than not, I do not know where my forefathers came from. How did they settle? I do not know whether they were able to have compassionate feelings towards their fellow people. Today also, when we look at a nation state like India with so much of diversity, more often than not, you don't even know what your neighbor is, where the neighbor comes from, what is the cultural construct of that neighbor. To add to it, there are castes, there are religions, there are cultural diversity. The link between territory and a homogeneous national identity is a key theme in a nation state building project. Territory and a homogeneous national identity. In many cases, this attempt to forge a national identity requires the subsuming of other ethnic, gender, and religious marker into a common affiliation with the nation. So, and if you look at today, any nation state across the world, you will see that more often than not, there is a constructed identity that this nation represents this. And one way of construing that identity is in terms of a common flag, some sort of a national language or set of national languages, or some sort of a common culture, festivals, etc., which somehow give a commonality to all the people residing in a particular territory. So it's like an imagined thing. And then there are two terms, nationality and nation. When a group of people have some kind of identity with regard to any race, language, mannerism, or even a sentimentality or emotional affinity, constitute a nationality. Kurds across Syria, Iraq, Turkey have some sort of a common language, mannerism to constitute a nationality. However, because they do not have a political status like independence, they are not a nation state. So, Kurds across the world, either who are staying in these three countries or in any country as a diaspora, then have this imagined nation. The moment a nationality gets a separate state of its own, it becomes a nation. State is a political entity. So nationality is some sort of an identity, common identity. When this common identity gets an independence or a separate state, it becomes a nation state. Hang on, there is some chat. What is the difference between nation state, nation and state, nation state, and state nation and civilization state? Who's asking that? Naman, so nation is more like an imagine. Naman, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so nation is more like an imagined community with some sort of a geographical boundary. State is a political entity. When there is a government which governs. It's a state. A nation state is when you have a state which is governing a nation with a specific geography. So India, US, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, these are all nation states. Now, civilization state is again a word which has been propounded by some scholars. So, for example, China, India, these are civilizational states because, say, for example, Chinese civilization depends on Ming dynasty or whichever dynasty, how it imagined China to be. So, for example, the Indian civilization state of Akhand Bharat, what they keep talking about, which includes other nation states, that's a civilizational state. It's more of a jargon, not even a jargon, but defined by some scholars in a particular way. Naman?
Yes, sir.
Got it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So again, as I said, it all depends on who is defining it, which scholar is defining it, and what is the the purview of that definition. How are you defining it? So and again, remember, it's a political thought. Anything which involves a state is a political thing. Nation state is a political entity. And more often than not, when we are dealing with all this, again, as I said, this particular unit delves in political sciences or political studies. So the moment a nationality gets a separate state, it becomes a nation. So let's now look at nation. Now we have done a little bit about transnation. We have done transnationality a lot, extended or going beyond national boundaries. So anytime a person travels from one nation to another, goes beyond the national boundaries, it is transnation, reaching beyond or transcending national boundaries. Differ from between within various disciplines. Again, multiple disciplines use transnation in multiple ways. For a purpose, the definition offered by Akira Airi of the study of movement and forces that have cut across national boundaries. In the word transnation, there is a word nation. Transnation, that is beyond the nation. So when a person moves from, let's say, one state of India to another state of India, technically we will not call it transnational or transnation, because you are within the same nation state of India. Though India, when we look at states, each state in itself in terms of diversity is almost like a nation state, but we have the larger territorial boundary of India and the nation state of India. So movement from one state to another is not transnational or nation. Moving from one nation state to another is transnation. Now, interestingly, subjects in a nation, as defined before, may at various times identify. So, irrespective of the fact that subjects in a nation state are in a territorial boundary, and it's imagined a lot of times these nations will identify with ethnicity, religion, family, tribe. They may not know the working of a state except for the experience of local officials. They may travel beyond national boundaries or stay with them and never be in contact with any cultural subject. But their experience provides the constant theme of ambiguous relation between nation and state. So they might belong to the nation of India or the nationality of India, but they are very ambiguous towards the state of India, or for that matter, any nation state. And that is why there are all these confusions which arise when we look at, the activities of various actors in a particular nation. Extending or going beyond national boundaries, reaching beyond or transcending national boundaries. Okay, yeah, this slide we have already done. Transnation reveals that all subjects have at least some level of ability to move between structures of the state. It is precisely this mobility and particularly symbolic threat to borders that has led nations to create states of exception. So inevitably, this movement between nation states, state is a political entity. And when subjects are moving beyond between states, there is always a threat to the state, to the structures of the state. And hence the nations create states of exception, camp outside yet within their borders. So, there is always the nation states create us versus them. This is again why it happens, is we will see as we go along. It's a very interesting thing why this thing happens. The emphasis on connection that exists below or above the level of a nation state was developed by Nye and Kihone in the description of transnational approach as focusing on contact, coalition, and interaction between state boundaries that are not controlled by central for. So inevitably, the ones what we had seen in terms of transnation, the difference between transnation and globalization was globalization is more at a state level, at a government level, whereas transnationalism is at an individual level. Now, more often than not, we had also seen that a lot of transnationalism was brought in by the governments from the top, by the state. They, by bringing in, let's say, an immigration policy, allowing people to move. Whereas at the same time, from below is when people on their own decide to migrate and move beyond national boundaries. Trans prefix emphasizes that identity is not linked to directly to residence in a particular territory and form a type of delocalized practice. So inevitably, they are saying that the trans is now inevitably we have been also talking about that each individual has a particular identity. Now, one of the identity markers is nationality, but there are other identity markers known as ethnicity, race, religion, cultural factors. All these are various identity markers. The trans, That is, the identity is not linked to the direct residence in a particular territory and forms a type of delocalized practice. So a transnational might be staying in the US and his identity is not directly linked to residence in a particular residence is not linked to the living in US, but his identity is linked to India from where that person comes in. That's the trans part of it. Now, if national space is conceived in the way as territory within which a singular people reside, the challenges presented by transnationalism are very apparent. So now the fact is there is a nation and nation has a state, a political entity. And now people are moving in and out of that boundary. Now, when people move, the immigration control and restricted access is threatened because the state wants to control. But here the people are having that agency to keep moving back and forth. It's like a family. More often than not, the family or the parents in the family would want a certain amount of control over their children. And if the child now keeps moving in and out, there is a sort of, threat to the political entity of the family, whereby what is going on? You are still dependent on me, and yet you seem to be taking your decision. In addition, new legal arrivals often contribute to a growing cultural diversity. The child is moving in and out of the house, interacting with the neighbors and outsiders, picking up new ideas which may or may not align with the family ideas. For example, more often than not, the neighbors ask the parents, what is your child going to do? And they expect an answer which is understandable by them. If a child does something different, more often than not, the neighbor may make a statement that your child is not under your control. Extend this to a state. So people now are keeping to move in and out. In terms of now, the state feels threatened in terms of control and restriction because the state wants to control. It's a political process. It's a political power. On top of that, there is this cultural diversity which goes in and out, which becomes threatening to a state. Ultimately, however, nations define themselves through the existence of a shared civic consciousness, classically expressed as a desire to achieve or maintain statehood. So inevitably, the pressure is to achieve and maintain a statehood. Statehood is a political entity, remember. Nationhood is more of an imagined community. The transnation extends beyond geographical, cultural, religious, and imaginative boundaries of the state, both within and beyond the boundaries of a nation. Nation is imagined. State is a political reality. I hope you are able to understand this concept. Nation is imagined. State is a political entity. Now, with people moving beyond the geographical, cultural, religious, and imaginative boundaries of the state, both within and beyond the boundaries of the nation. And then we are talking about a nation state, where there is an imagined community, at the same time, there is a political entity. For Kione and Nai, transnationalism encompasses all interactions across state boundaries in which at least one of the participants is not an agent of government. And that's what we said. Globalization involves government, state to state. Transnationalism is people. Their emphasis is thus not on the scope of operation, but on the public or private character of the participant in operation. All interaction, not just organization one, international trade, international travel, are included as transnational processes. Somebody has asked, is there a difference between nation state and a welfare state? Okay, so yes, there is a difference in the sense that Dave, Depragya, so nation is an imagined community. When this imagined community gets a political freedom, it becomes a state in terms of a political entity. Okay, so that's a nation state. Now, when this nation state decides to take on the role of welfare, it becomes a welfare state. So, for example, let's say the state says that the welfare of all its citizens is the responsibility of state. It's a welfare state. So, by far, per se, one of the principles of democracy is welfareism, because at the end of the day, the citizens of a particular state shed some of their sovereignty to the state. In turn, the state takes care of them. Depragya?
Yes, sir. But I am still confused.
Okay, so welfare, so inevitably you have understood the fact that nation is a group of people, imagined, imagined community.
Yes, sir. Nation, because yeah, the different scholars came up with different ideologies, and yeah, that's fine.
Once they get a government, they become a nation state.
Yeah,
Correct?
because for the state, there are 4 things that have to be there. I mean, legally.
Correct.
It has to be the population, the sovereignty, it has to be recognized, and also the government.
Correct. Now, when this nation states decides that one of its owners or one of its key responsibility is the welfare of its citizens, and this welfare is translated into let's say subsidies or reservations for the backward, or the fact is pensions, disability pensions, it becomes a welfare state.
Okay, so because when we are talking right now is, when you are saying that, yeah, it's kind of a threat when people are moving. Right. So, correct. I mean, in that context, I want to understand the welfare state, basically.
So, inevitably, when a person moves, say, for example, we have studied in a lot of diasporas, when for example, in the European diaspora, when a person moves from any country, or for, let's say, India, an Indian is getting a disability pension or an old age pension, and this Indian moves from India to, let's say, Europe. Now, when the person moves, would he still get the disability or old age pension, or once he moves to another country, then he gets governed by another? So the state will create an elaborate structure whereby it will look after the welfare of its citizens based on its various requirements, and that's what is welfare state. So mostly, Depragya, most modern states, especially democracies, are welfare states.
Yes, I've understood. Maybe I'll have more questions.
Perfectly fine.
Yeah, okay.
Perfectly fine. But welfare state is a type of state. So typically, a state can be only taking taxes and securing the citizens in terms of external threats. But as I said,
because we have North Korea, we have a lot of countries, for example, and then we have, yes, welfare states are democracies.
So more often than not, modern nation states, especially democracies, are geared up for welfare states, as welfare states. Okay? Yes, but again, these definitions also might be different for different people. Some might say that the very fact that the state is taking taxes to protect the citizens from external threat itself is welfareism, but that's not, classically welfareism. Welfareism is to take care of individual needs of individual citizens. You can just Google it and see what scholars are saying it, and we can discuss it as we go along.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Okay. Patel offers a useful summary of the etymology of Transnation. First, so look at the term itself. First surfaced as a term in discussion of migration and identity in the US in 1919, locating its use in the conscious effort to internationalize American politics with the framework of wider world. So a lot of times when we use a particular term, that term actually had a different context and then it became mainstream. During subsequent decades in books on Anglo-American economic relation in the interwar period and the study of law in the 50s, the word was primarily employed to extending of having interest, extending beyond national boundaries or frontiers. So the word started being used as something else and went on to something else. For example, let me share another example. The term artificial intelligence was a marketing term. Within welfare state, there can be an internal division between some states providing more service. Absolutely, Shrestha. So it all depends on what you define as welfareism. So, for example, the very concept of even reservations, which the Indian Constitution provided, was a part of the welfareism to bring up the backward castes and give them a fair opportunity to, to come in the mainstream. So there are a lot of debates and argument about reservation, about merit versus reservation. That's a separate thing altogether. But the founding fathers of Constitution inevitably thought many things before they came up with these particular things. So when you are giving free education, you're giving free healthcare, that's a part of the welfareism, because at the end of the day, people are giving you taxes. Every citizen, we all give taxes. And this argument that, everybody does not give taxes is wrong, because any economic activity that any citizen does in a nation state is tax oriented. Whenever I buy something, whenever I use something, any service I do, there's a tax to it. Electricity, water, any economic activity I do is taxable. So as I was saying, this particular, how the term transnationalism came in, how it started, took a life inside nation states and seemed to be used primarily as an alternative term for interstate relations. So it became more of a jargon to be used. In fact, interestingly, over a period of time, this is how diaspora studies started coming in and transnationalism. So today, the current trend is transnationalism. And there's a lot of grants coming in transnationalism. So there is a lot of conferences on transnationalism. Say, for example, was adopted by multinational corporation that wanted to rebrand themselves as transnational corporation, because multinational had become a negative connotation. So interestingly, if you find out etymologically or how the word originated, you will sometimes get surprised that actually this was something else and it becomes something else. Okay. Stress the importance of recognizing diversity in transnational practices while practices. Okay, let me just move on. So inevitably, as we have seen, when people are moving across nation states, one of the factors is obviously the power of a nation states decreases, in the sense people now have agency to just move across. And a lot of times it almost appears that the nation state is in crisis. So is actually a nation state in crisis? These challenges are it is arguing coming from above in the form of global governance. So now there are global governance organizations like IMF and World Trade Organization, supranational institutions like European Union, transnational corporations. And then from below, there are migrant networks, cross-border forums, political activism. Is the nation state in a crisis? It's a question mark. So let's see, is it really in a crisis or not? If transnationalism is understood as sustained activities across national borders, then the importance of national scale and national space that can be translated through these practices, a process is obvious. But however, the transnational or transnation has the term nation in it. So the first identity marker is inevitably the nation. that the continued importance of the nation state is a key feature distinguishing transnationalism from the supposedly more deterritorialized concept of globalization. So, irrespective of the fact that people are traveling from one nation state to another, the nation state still is the marker or the identity which is chosen. It's like, a baseline. More often than not, even the fourth generation or third generation of people staying in, let's say, Suriname or Africa or Guyana, inevitably may choose to, align with India because their ancestors were Indian, but somewhere down the line, there is an identity marker of Indian. One of the key processes in the construction of transnational communities or social fields is migration. As highlighted, greater global migration resulted in millions of Indians outside nation state of origin. Hang on, what is it? Post 9/11, the state has gained relevance again, and recent was rise of right everywhere has brought back the state. Naman, the state had never disappeared. See, somewhere down the line, the state is always there, and more often than not, in each of our lives, the state has a very important part. So we might choose to believe that the state has kind of shed its importance, or the state is not there. It's something like this. The more the people are migrating, the more there seems to be this trend of anti-migration sentiment across the world. So as we were discussing sometime in the earlier units, these contradictions will continue in the life of human beings. For example, a contradiction of the fact that 2 world wars has told us that the war is never a solution to any political problem, and yet we seem to be having wars, and somehow we seem to feel that there are more wars than what they were earlier, which is again not true. In
Yes,
fact,
sir, what I was trying to say is that like when the Bretton Woods institutions were formed, the United Nations came into existence. So there was more focus on this globalization process,
correct,
non-governmental actors. So a bit of the state sovereignty was being diluted, but the recent trends across the globe have shown that the state is coming back at the center. So that is what I'm trying to say.
Perfectly fine. I agree with whatever you're saying, Naman, and I'm adding that somewhere down the line, that was some sort of an imagined idea that the state sovereignty was being diluted. The state sovereignty was always there, because inevitably the very fact that when you leave a particular nation state, you need to have a passport from your nation, and you need to have a visa from the other nation. So the state was always there, sovereign. You couldn't move without that. Naman?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So interestingly,
Sir, like what I'm trying to say is that the very concept of globalization, like if something happens in USA, so that is likely going to affect the whole world, like in terms of economics. For example, the recently the Houthis have been attacking in the Red Sea area, the merchant ships.
Correct.
So that is something which is affecting the whole world, the global economy. Like we are more independent with each other, interdependent on each other.
Correct.
Era.
Correct. Absolutely.
That was what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. State sovereignty for smaller and weaker states have been easily shaken by strong. But, again, Shrestha, inevitably, a lot of times, the way we, kind of imagine things, there was always a certain amount of interdependency. Naman, the point is, as human beings, and this is before the interdependence in terms of media, in terms of faster transportation, the very fact the ancient civilization of Indus Valley, of Nile, of various civilization also were interdependent, because if you look at their basic, whatever material that we have in terms of, their artifacts, they were always influenced with each other. But as the world communication networks and the transport networks started, so when the explorers started exploring the various countries of the world and started setting up these trading networks, the world was already interdependent on each other. It has only got worse with the fact with now faster communication access. So again, it was not that the wars were not happening earlier. Now we get the information. Previously, by the time we would get the information, it was possibly the war was over or something else would have happened.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Similarly, smaller states and weaker states were always dependent on. So, the interesting part of newness, what we perceive as a new thing, see, new always builds on the old. And if you see, most of our political thought or our philosophical thought comes built from possibly the Greek philosophers, the Chinese philosophers, or various philosophies which were already circulating. So a lot of things that we study now or we think that it is new actually have been rehashed or the same thing have been added. Okay. For all the talk of fluidity and porosity, nation states still exercise power of who legally enters the nation space. So inevitably, that's what I said. In spite of the fact that, somewhere down the line, there's a lot of scholars who feel that the nation state has become impotent. There are the supranational state. There is still the sovereignty and the power of the state continues. The hyphen that links this nation to the state is also challenged through say, for example, there was this Japan case study. The hyphen that links the nation to the state is also challenged through the arrival of ethnic Japanese individuals. So there were these Japanese individuals who went to Brazil and then they came back, lure of manufacturing jobs in their links to homeland. Yamanaka demonstrates that this shared ancestry counts for little as the Japanese state treats them as non-citizens. The same thing happened with Indians. A lot of Indians who in the 60s went professionals, medical or technical, when they came back, they expected the Indian state to treat them differently, which did not happen. Again, case study of Asia Pacific. Emigration is challenging the territory-nation identity link. While emigration is nothing new, the ways in which some of the nation states have begun to mobilize discourses of migration within discourses of nationalism have become increased. So within, discourses of migration, within discourses of nationalism. And if you see across the world, there is a uptick of nationalism. Through such processes, it's clear that the nation state is a continued presence in the process of nationalism well beyond the physical state boundaries. So this whole concept of coming back, connecting back with your nation state or with your nation identity has an ulterior motive of economics. It's again an imagined community. However, what is happening in the cases of nation states of Asia Pacific is promoting the vision and implementing policies to encouraging links back home outside nation, and that has to do with economics, the remittances. Because if those people who have gone out, you are not going to pump in the nationalism, why would they want to connect back and send money? Still remains an important part of the states have a number of reasons for using the discourse to encompass individuals who no longer live within the territorial boundaries. The reasons are all linked to the concept of economic development. We had already seen in one of the earlier units that one of the reasons why people migrate is economics. There is a demand and the supply goes to meet the demand. So there has been all these recruitment of people for as labor for Israel, even when there is a war going on and there are huge queues, because inevitably there's a demand and here there's an excess of supply. So more often than not, a whole lot of things in the world has an underlying of an economic basis. One of the bases. Philippines is often held as a country that epitomizes the ways in which non-resident Filipinos are vital. Importance: the Philippine state has been keen to facilitate immigration while seeking to ensure that the immigrants maintain their ties to homeland, because the large part of their economy works out of remittances. Highlights how discourses around migrants as new heroes promote the concept of Philippine nation, spreading far beyond the national boundaries. So what has happened is, rather than the nation state confine itself to the territorial boundary of the state, today the nation state itself has become deterritorialized. It has become flexible. It has become...
I have a question.
Tell me.
When we talk about China, because yes, China's usurpation policy, be it Taiwan, be it Tibet, be it Hong Kong, how are we going to place China in this whole system?
What do you mean by how we go to place?
Yeah, nation state, welfare state, because...
See, China is a nation state. Very clear. China... I was reading, there was a particular scholar who was talking about China being a civilizational state. Obviously, it's an older civilization. There has been over a period of Chinese civilization, and how China looks at the world. So inevitably, also you are forgetting the fact that in between all these nation states, there is a geopolitical power which works. So for example, every nation wants to become a global power. And inevitably today, with the waning of Russia, it is today again a bipolar world of US and China. So China is looking at expanding its territory in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and it wants to... And if you see today, when you look at things like artificial intelligence or cutting edge technology, the fight is between US and China. So there was one scholar who was writing the fact that the Ukraine-Russian war is actually a shadow boxing of China and US. Devpragya?
Yes, sir.
So China is saying that, so for example, it is making claim. For example, India makes claim when it talks about Akhand Bharat, saying that this is part of India, this is part of India. It is how it is looking at in terms of geopolitics. Similarly, China is looking at in terms of geopolitics. So don't mix the geopolitics with the concept of... So China is a nation state. China is a nation state like India. What is China doing in terms of other things is in terms of geopolitics. Devpragya?
Yes.
So these are two different things.
Understood. Yeah,
when we are doing migration and diaspora studies, let's not look at geopolitics. Geopolitics affects it in different ways.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hang on. So, for example, there is another case study of IT professionals from India. Zhang Bio studies this, how these IT professionals move from India to multiple countries. What is the reason why they are moving? Knowledge economy, shortage of approach. So they are able to, they know about their skills, maybe resonant of concept of transnational capital class. So they make their networks, they figure out where there is a need, and in all that, they use Malaysia and Singapore as a launching pad. How migrants are able to negotiate using their skills as bargaining tools and then use access to permanent residencies or citizenship right elsewhere as new tools with which they move on. So while the state is also changing in terms of understanding with or negotiating with transnationalism, so are the people. So one thing is very clear, that A, transnationalism involves a nation state. B, in spite of the fact of globalization and the human migration or transnationalism movement, the state the nation state still is the identity marker or the baseline, where the state now is mobilizing or bringing in the concept of nationalism to all its citizens who are not within the territorial boundary of the state, so that these people continue to be engaged with the state, and the nation state still has its control over everybody all around. Meanwhile, the citizens are able to negotiate with multiple nation states and decide where is beneficial for them or not beneficial for them. Similarly to the case where all these Europeans who went to Argentina but kept their dual citizenship because it was advantage to them. I think we have already crossed our time. Okay. Any questions? Let me stop the share. Hang on. Let me start the video. Here. Any questions?
Something.
Shrestha, your voice is cutting. I hope is everybody here able to hear Shrestha?
I can hear you.
Okay. Shrestha, tell me now.
Okay. Am I audible now?
You are audible, but your voice was cutting in between.
Okay, sir. So my question is, presently, the kind of transnational governance that can be that we see happening in like real practical terms, what the UN does, or for instance, what the International Court of Justice does in terms of their legislation, or their reach and the manner of, I think, their operation across countries in the world. So, I since we are all aware that, these are powerful organizations which are uh, in which they are the role of, the stakeholders in these organizations are also from developed and powerful countries. So, do we see a form of resistance from the smaller countries, Africa, Asia, the global south, to such transnational organizations and their practical day to day, or for instance, any kind of interventions that these organizations do make in such countries?
Shrestha, so what you're trying to say is there are these transnational organizations like the UN. UN is is a actually it's not a it's a multinational organization. Okay, transnational organization. Do the smaller nations have a problem with this transnational organizations? Shrestha, are you talking about that?
Yes, sir. In a way, there must be a conflict of interest at times because of the kind of geopolitics that, is followed the way we see it playing around.
See, in fact, over the last, as we have seen in the near past, it seems the bigger countries seem to have more problems with this transnational organization. For example, US was having major problems with the UN during the time of President Trump. Funds were cut. See, inevitably, uh, today the domestic has got converged with the international more often than not. With the advent of globalization and the faster media and the faster transportation, and on top of that the nation state extending beyond the territorial boundaries, and the transnationalism because of people movement, because transnationalism is always people, globalization is on the government level. All these factors, actually there is this between what UN say, for example, look at the fact when UN says don't do this, or for example, thinks about the fact that, and in fact, this is what we are going to be studying in the next unit about human rights. Today, when we have two world wars, we have seen and we have realized the fact, humankind has realized the fact that no solution comes out of a war, and yet we see wars happening, and in that wars, the net sufferer are those people who have nothing to do with wars. So when the attack on Israel happened, the sufferers were common Israeli citizens. When the attack on Palestine or the Gaza is happening, the net sufferers are the Palestinians. The UN is taking positions vis-a-vis the US and the West lobby vis-a-vis other lobby. So, for example, yesterday the International Court of Justice has ruled 15-2 in favor that Israel should stop its attack. Is Israel listening to that? Is US listening to that? So there is this new thing happening whereby coalitions are being formed. So it is not as easy as the fact that the smaller nations are getting uneasy because of UN is controlled mainly by security compulsory. With exactly, Kangat is absolutely right. It elects security general from third world countries to carry out agenda of security council. However, the vetoes is not with the third world countries. And that is why one of the reasons what India did after it secured it independent, and the first prime minister, what he did was get this non-aligned movement to try and create a heft between the two global powers. When countries, absolutely, Naman, you're absolutely right. So inevitably, supranational organizations, the countries have to somehow work out to follow them, and yet there is this domestic compulsion on various countries or other economic considerations. So, for example, today, public opinion in the US is very strongly against the war, and yet the US seems to be supporting the war. So obviously there is some other considerations which is coming in. So it is becoming more complex. At the same time, there is this active negotiation which needs to happen. And if you see, very interestingly, Africa was the country which took Israel to court, subsequently followed by Mexico and Chile. So there is a new kind of formation, and this is the typical way the world is functioning, how organizations have to form. In terms of global politics, what is your heft? And today those heft can come out of transnational people, from diasporas, from supranational organization. How are you creating that heft? Shrestha?
Yes, sir.
I hope I've been able to roundaboutly answer that question, because there is no straightforward answer to it. It's a complex negotiation. And inevitably, that's how it's something like, that's why we create networks, because those networks help us in our everyday movement in terms of where we get stuck. Inevitably, there's politics all around, na? Individuals, organization, countries. How are you working out? That is what diplomacy does. How are you able to protect your interest on the world stage? And there is this global politics, geopolitics which work. How are you protecting your interest and at the same time able to get what you want? Guys? Shesha?
Yes, sir. I understood.
Okay. Any other question? We are already 10 minutes more in this class. Any other question? If anybody wants the PPT, you can send me a mail. I can send you the PPT. There were certain things I didn't, because it was a little, I thought it was very important to explain this concept of nation, state, transnationalism, how these words originated. It is not as straightforward as what we say. If it's not nation, then it's transnational, and so on and so forth. So anybody wants the PPT, you can email it to me. Email me a mail, and I'll send you the PPT. And if there is no other question, then have a nice weekend. We meet next Saturday with the next unit 21, which is on human rights. Bye then. Bye guys. Okay.